Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Soulganize Your Life podcast. And I'm realizing the more that I Soulganize my own life, the more fun I'm actually having as a human. So the human in us gets sort of dinged or stimulated in two different ways. And one is through which I would call as a therapist the psychological ego. And the other way is through our divine soul connection to all that is. So why is it important to know the difference? Well, that's where our guests are invaluable. And that's why we have them on the podcast, is because they each have a really cool explanation to help relate us to this inner conflict within us between the ego and the soul, as well as give us ideas on how to integrate those two perspectives into one full, beautiful human experience. And so today I would like to welcome Margie Bro, who is too many things to introduce with. So I'm just going to let her jump in and start because we only have 30 minutes.
Thank you so much, Wynn. So as she said, my name is Margie Bro. I am a foundational root teacher, energy medicine specialist. You name it, I probably have some sort of training in it, but really all of the modalities that I'm trained in are woven back through the lens of natural law. So I am mentored by Lisa Ashwari Murphy, the founder of Svaha Yoga and Synergy of Sound Academy. And the way that we do all of our modalities, whether it's Reiki, sound, oral transmission, mediumship, and working in our psychic mediumship, is really weaving it all way through that natural law lens. So natural law is bon pro, pre-religion, the way that people knew how to work in unison with nature, knowing that we were a part of that system and not separate from it. So the way that I do all of the work that I do is weaving it back into that lens and allowing people to come back into that natural rhythm and allowing me to come back into that natural rhythm. So I become a way shower of that way of being, not by pulling myself out of the worldly way, but bringing myself back into the natural way and then going into the world, knowing that I am in the world, but not of it.
Yeah, see, there's no way I could have explained that as well as you just did. And I agree with you on so many things, that there is a natural law and that all occurred before we ever had any semblance of, man-made religion or human engineering, and even before the ego, right? Which I don't know when and how it got created, but that's the focus of our podcast. And the difference between that and what you said was natural law, or what I would call the soul and the soul's journey. So if you don't mind, kind of tell us your own journey of where you first recognized maybe that you had an ego or that you had a soul. Where did you start with your self-awareness?
That's a wonderful question. And so to understand where that like aha moment came, you have to understand a little bit of like who I was before that aha moment.
Yes.
And so when I was young and when I was a kid, I was um, in a place where a lot of my parents' generational traumas and projections were put on me. So at a really young age, I was led to believe that I was a liar. I was told to look in the mirror and tell myself I was a liar. I was
Wow.
really pulled apart from my own emotional recognition and being able to identify the way that I felt, because I always was taught that the way that I was feeling was wrong, and that, I really felt this way, or I was always fed some sort of narrative about myself. And along the way, I tended to believe in those narratives. So I created these belief systems that were handed to me. And so I didn't know that there was an option to not agree. So I was moving in the world and I was operating as a liar. I operated in a lot of codependent relationships. I really invited chaos. I was a people pleaser, and there was a lot of bully energy that was always like in my sphere, because I thought I was this victim of life. And so I never felt like I had any sort of semblance control over what I was doing or where I was going. And there were a lot of parts of myself, or what I thought were parts of myself, that I didn't like, because they didn't feel true to me. Like, I didn't feel true that I liked chaos. It didn't feel true that I liked drama. It didn't feel true that, I was the cause and source of pain. These things didn't feel true to me, but they operated there because I was sold these stories from time and time and time and time. And so as I went into my adulthood, I was in and out of therapy from a really young age. I would say about 11 is when I started therapy, and I was in and out of therapy until in my early 20s. And talk therapy armed me with the ability to like be really analytical. Like, I could now like analyze these things really well, but like had no skill set on what to do with them,
Yeah.
or what was my intuition, or like, yes, I know that I can tell the truth, but why am I lying? Where's the root of all of these things that I'm experiencing?
Mhm, mhm.
And I was eventually introduced to Reiki as my first healing modality that I experienced myself. And after getting that done on myself a few times, I wanted to start learning more. So I started learning Reiki as my first like way into a healing modality. And when I was learning Reiki, it was very disconnected, which is a lot of people learn in this way in the spiritual world. Like you go in, you're with your client, you turn your energy on and you're this conduit of healing. And then you leave the session, you turn your energy off, and then you have to go into the world and you're in your heavy and dense shit. Excuse me, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear here.
Absolutely. Well,
And so
before you keep going, I would just love to say I can tell how self-aware you are by the eloquence in which you are relating your narrative and your personal story. It is just seamless. So I just want to first point that out. And secondly, is because of the podcast is about the ego and the soul. I just want to point out what you identified was so spot on, right? The ego is a set of beliefs that you have been trained into believing. And it's not the real you, it's not your soul based you because it doesn't feel authentic. Like you
yeah,
said,
it feels very disconnected.
yeah. And you said I was doing the behaviors, right? You said I was attracting chaos, I was lying, I was having this bullying, but it's not, it felt that's the ego right there, right? That's
Yeah.
it. That's where you're like, I'm doing these behaviors, they don't feel like me. And like, but then the world sees the behavior and tells you that it is you. And it just reaffirms the ego that was shoved into your awareness when you were a kid and it wasn't your fault. And like, this is just a perfect explanation. And thank you so much for such a great introduction. So keep going.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, those are those limiting beliefs and and the patterns that are born from them that we didn't know we didn't have the ability to not agree to at the
No,
time.
yes,
And
yes. So
so I was I went into the Reiki and, learned to turn it on and off. And I was like, why do I want to go into the world and turn it off? I don't want to turn it off.
yeah,
This doesn't feel resonant. And I found myself like wanting to soak in all of the knowledge. I was like reading books and listening to podcasts and taking all these courses. And, I started to get overwhelmed with all the information because I was like,
yes.
there's so much here. There's so much to learn. How do I know? And so eventually a friend of mine introduced me to the community that I now grow with now called the Svaha Yoga and Synergy of Sound Academy. And this was about 7 years ago. And I took my first natural law class. And I was a person who was like really stuck in positive projection, negative things I didn't want to deal with. Like I very much went to that separation. Like I did not come into the place of balance. It was positive, it was negative, it was good, it was bad, it was black, it was white, right? I was very in the positive projective place where I didn't want to even acknowledge any heavier dense things because we put things into boxes so often as humans, right? Like this is a positive emotion, this is a negative emotion, this is a good trait, this is a bad trait, right? I didn't
Yes.
want to look at any of the negative. And so I was stuck in like this high pitched customer service voice where like I was always in people pleaser, always in fawning, always like I talked really fast and my hands were always going. And like I looked like a little bit like a cartoon character. I sounded like one too. And so in this natural law class, actually, the law that they were teaching about was law of polarity. And so
Yes, there we go.
when
Love
I
it.
learned about the law of polarity, it was like a light bulb went off. And this was like the true moment where like my soul awakens, all my DNA, I felt like an explosion of light just like went through my entire body. And I could see the path. Like if I keep going this way, I'll liberate. If I keep going the way that I'm going, I'm going to continue to be in pain and suffering. Do
Yeah.
I
Can
want
you
liberation or do I want pain and suffering? And I made a choice there to continue to learn.
And so can you explain for the audience who might be listening what the law of polarity is? We've never talked about that on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the beginning of the podcast, I talked about natural law. Law
Yeah.
polarity is one of those natural laws. So the law of polarity talks about how everything in the world has a built-in duality. And
Yes.
so So often we separate things into positive and negative, light and dark, up and down, black and white. But truly, to have balance and to have power is to be in the awareness of both and
Yes.
understand that it is with the awareness and the embracing of both that we have true power. So think of like an atom, right? An atom doesn't just have positive or negative ions, it has to have positive and negative to actually exist. If it had just one or the other, it would explode or implode. And people do that too when we go just into positive or negative. We go into that black and white thinking. And so to have true power, to have charge or like a battery, you have to actually be the nucleus in the center and the awareness and have the balance of both moving around you and the awareness and that equanimity so that you're staying balanced time over time no matter what is happening around you. So it's the ability to not get swept up in the storm of like when our limiting beliefs and our patterns are starting to be triggered. It's being able to observe them. So we want to sit in the middle like the nucleus. So that's like a long-winded way to talk about the law of
Yeah,
polarity.
and I would say like another analogy, which you can tell me whether you agree with, is the ego and the soul is a polarity as well, because the ego is our personal preferences. It is our mental activity. It is the thing that wants to keep our body alive, but yet in reality, right, it is not, that is not the case. Reality is not about my personal preferences at all. My reality is not about just worrying about my own body at all. There are so many things in support of that. And when I think of polarity in like without judgment, right? Like oxygen is good for me and maybe carbon dioxide is not good for me. But it's the opposite for the tree that I'm standing in reality, right? So if I don't judge carbon dioxide or oxygen, I can see how they are in relationship to one another. One might be negative for me to breathe in, but one is positive for the tree to breathe in. So if you take out the judgment or the good and the bad, this is how I'm starting to understand polarity, is that we need both things. And it's up to us to stay in the middle and determine what's actually right for our own specific body.
Yeah, so that's actually a couple of laws too, right? Like that's like the law of divine oneness and the law
Mhm.
of rhythm and the law of correspondence and the law of giving and receiving. So
Yeah.
that is a lot of things in one. And typically when we're talking about one law, there are many things at play. Uh,
Yes.
that like they all work so congruently and so effortlessly together
Mhm.
because they just exist in nature. So when we start to have these aha moments of like where they're operating, there really is so many that are operating within that one. But I love that you're using that as an example as well.
Yeah. So do you define the polarity within you as a soul and an ego, or what are your words that you use?
So when I'm thinking about the law of polarity that exists within a human being, I'm thinking typically it's like the positive, negative, dark and light analogies that I'm using. I don't always bring it to like the ego and the soul, because although they are opposites, they both have a function. And so where the ego is like the fear based and the ego
Yeah.
goes into those limitations and it's the stories, and we're taught that the ego is actually in charge because it's up in the brain and people think that the brain is in charge, but truly it's the soul which is actually operating from our heart and comes from that toroidal
Mhm.
field. That's what's
Mhm.
actually in the driver's seat. And so our ego needs a job, and the job is to come into the heart and to take guidance from the heart, but we separate it in the world. In the worldly
Yeah.
way, we separate it and we tell people to use their logic and to, don't go with your emotions and go
Yes.
with, what makes the most sense. But what makes the most sense is not necessarily what is from a fear-based place, because a fear-based place is very limiting. And so I operate in the belief that a belief system that limits you isn't the truth. So if you're operating in that ego, you're most likely limited in some way, and there is
Mhm.
most definitely judgment and separation occurring.
Yeah. Awesome. And so I know the topic that we sort of agreed we'd kind of move into today is moving from the fact that there's a bunch of, I have an ego, then a bunch of egos get together and they create a collective ego.
Mhm.
Right? And that you are trying to move people towards conscious communities, or what I would call like a soul-based community, where people are not acting from the old fears and limiting beliefs in a group way, right? So like a collective fear or collective group limited belief could be still charging an entire community or business, right? And you're trying to do something very groundbreaking, which is, to bring in the individual work that you've done, on an individual or yourself, such as Reiki, into a group. Is that about right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so it would be a merging of all the modalities and allowing people to understand that they have access to these things all the time. So it
Mm,
like when I'm moving through the day, there are multiple times in the day that I am engaging in meditation. There's multiple times in the day that I'm doing breath work. There's multiple times in the day where I'm doing a mantra, or that I am awakening my bio scalar energy field, or that I'm doing what I call the connections pair. So there's multiple times in the day that I do that,
mm,
or engaging in mindful movement or somatic practices. There's multiple times in a day that I'm doing that, and it doesn't look the same every day. It looks like what I need each day. And it also looks like, what is the energy that I need? Do I need to have more grounding energy? Do I need to have more compassion? Do I need to have more fire to cut through? Do I need to expand like the
mm,
space? Do I
mm.
need do I need to have more flow like the water? What is it that I need in this moment? And that's the energy that I'm going to call in, and then I'm going to embody, and then I'm going to use a practice to help myself do.
Love
And
it.
so what I'm teaching people to do, and what my goal is on a large scale and a global scale, is to help people in groups be able to embody that together. So like what you were saying, a group can come into this place where they're operating in the fear and the limitation. And so often we do that. We in the community that I work with, we call it the opposite vortex. So the opposite vortex is like going into that place where all of these people have all of these worries and all these fears and all these limitations. And because they exist and they're not rooted in a place of loving compassion, if you're not rooted in a place of love and compassion, you will entrain to the most discordant frequency. And the most discordant frequency is that worry, that fear, that ego place, that place of
Yes.
limitation. And so when you don't have people who are rooted in love and compassion, because they have no idea what that even means, or how to get into those practices, or even how to become into a conscious witness so they can understand when they're being triggered, and so that they can practice the pause before they agree, because they realize they don't have to, because they have the power to not agree with those thoughts that come in. Because no matter
Mm,
how practiced or learned you are, no matter how much wisdom you have, the fact of the matter is that you still have an ego. It still exists. And
yes.
so though, no matter how much I meditate, no matter how much I do my earthing practices or my mantras or my meditations, no matter how much I do that, right, limitations are still going to come in. Those thoughts are
Yeah.
still going to come in. I
Yeah.
just now have the power to observe them and not agree, right?
Yeah. So
And
and can you speak to how that shows up in maybe a collective community or business?
yeah, so that happens a lot in collective communities or businesses, right? So
Yeah.
all these people come into this space and they have these ideas or these thoughts or these beliefs or these fears, all of these things that happen. And then rules get created within these businesses, and
Yeah.
systems get created based on these fears, and people are all
Yeah.
operating inside of this business or inside of these communities based on these very opposite vortex systems that are created. Think about the systems that are created in our world right now, and how many of them that we're seeing break down, because they're not actually solution based, they're not actually heart based, they're not actually built on nature, right? They're actually built in direct opposition of how our natural systems are supposed to flow. And so my goal, and when we're thinking about team based and working in those teams, is to help create a space where people can come into a collective where they're operating in a place where they can break down those systems of oppression within a team, and so that
Mm,
they're not operating in those fear-based systems any longer. Where they kind of, you're breaking out of the mold yourself, and then you're breaking the mold and way showing for people in teams. And that's really the goal of what I'm doing. And
yeah.
so when you're like, think about when you go into an office space and there's all these rules and limitations and things that you can't do because, one person is afraid of this, or this rule is made because this one bad thing happened one time. And then no ingenuity is happening. No out of the box thinking is happening. No one can be creative. Everything's stagnant and flat. And that is not a place where any people can thrive truly, because we we thrive off creativity. We thrive off of being able to use both sides of our brain. But because all of these rules get put into place and hierarchies and separation and all of these people who want some semblance of false power, because it's not really true power because it's born out of fear, and then they create these systems based on that. And so when you are liberating from those types of systems, you find that when you are operating from a place of ahimsa, and in first your first rule is to do no harm, and that you're considering that you are a part of all things and all things are a part of you, then the way that you are going to make rules and the way that you're going to create systems are going to be a lot different than if you created rules and systems around fear and wanting to have a false sense of power and control over people.
Yeah. So I had so many like pictures in my head when you were talking. So I just imagined someone sitting at a job and maybe they're having their own spiritual awakening, right? They've had an ego that came into the job that experienced enough fear and experienced enough of like old rules and systems that may have been developed from a collective ego from, 20 years ago. And one of the things like that comes up for me is the media, right? Like a news station that was born in the 50s and sort of developed this way of being, right? And so so you're saying, so one person is in there and they're like, the normal thing to do before COVID, I would say, and probably during COVID, was people would look for a career counselor or people would quit and look for a new job. And then during COVID, we saw what they called the great resignation or the quiet quitting, right? Things where people were so done with what you're saying, right? Like so done with dealing with a fear-based model that it's upheaved so many of these businesses or maybe communities. And so what you're suggesting instead is, instead of leaving this business or leaving, is to first identify your own personal triggers, identify your own desire for compassion, of everyone is literally just working off of a system that they didn't even create.
Correct.
Right. And then hopefully consider, what could I possibly do as one person to start bringing in conversation about conscious business, and what does that look like even?
Well, it's going to be different for everybody based on what business they're in. And for me, my goal of my business and the work that I'm doing is that like a business would hire me to come in and help do that for their team, because
Yeah.
the person at the lead recognizes that there needs to be a change. And it's people within the organization that are going to be voicing these and say, we need change, right? We need change management. We need these systems aren't working. And for someone at the top to listen, someone at the top needs to know that like these systems aren't working. And instead of being afraid, because so what happens so often in businesses and communities and governments and nonprofits is they keep the systems and they lose the people. Right?
Yes.
They're like, well, these are the systems that work. These are the systems that work. But your people keep leaving and people are not doing well. So what do you mean these are the systems that work? So all it takes is one person to understand that if we want to keep good people and we want to keep our people healthy and we want to keep our people sane, spacious, and free, well, then the systems have to change and they have to be based on a model that is good for everybody. And that's where really my work would come into play.
I love you said sane, spacious, and free. Man, that's all anybody really wants at work.
I want to be sane, spacious, and free. And because we live in the world, right? We are in the world. There are always going to be these jobs that occur because we're in the world. And so the goal is not to like dismantle all of these things. It's how do we bring consciousness into these places? How do we bring flow into these places? And that is by changing the way that teams operate. And so that will always start with one person, because typically there's not a mass awakening within a government or within an organization or a nonprofit or a private entity. But that awakening has to come from somebody who's not afraid to use their voice, somebody who's not afraid to push the envelope and push for change, and who's going to stay regardless if the change is occurring within some sort of like time frame, right? Like if you notice the change needs to happen, you need to move right away because you need to be sane, spacious, and free. That that's okay. But if you are able to stay in a place and stay grounded and bring that energy to a space and help create the change by doing that, because what we do when we are able to shift our vibration is we are now holding the highest coherent frequency. People will begin to entrain to us. That's what happens
Mm.
when we hold highest coherent frequencies,
Yeah.
right? People entrain to that highest coherent frequency, or they fall away from you as a vibration, and that's not personal, it's just energetic. And so when you're moving through the world and you're doing this work for yourself, right? You're showing up just for yourself. You have the power just by showing up for yourself to affect the vibration of 144,000 people. That is just by doing the work for you. That is just by showing up for you. So when you're showing up and you're doing it intentionally to shift vibrations elsewhere, you're doing it intentionally to go into your office building and shift those vibrations, you're able to actually affect more change because you're doing it with intention, and you're doing it with the intention to move into the collective, to have a change in the vibration of the people around you. So understanding that, like, understanding natural law and where we fall in vibration and rhythm and correspondence and giving and receiving and all of the things that I talk about is understanding that we have that power. And it's a choice. It's a choice that we have to make every day. It's a choice that we make consciously through moving out of the ego and being able to observe it and into the conscious observer or the compassionate witness. And that is the soul, right? That is the heart. That is moving down into that place. It's understanding that serves a function. Our ego serves a function, but we don't have to agree with it or stay there.
Yeah. Well, and I love what you said, and I agree with you. You know, we all agreed to be on this planet and to have human engineering and man-made things and businesses and money, and that's not necessarily needs to go anywhere. We don't need to dismantle anything in particular. It's more of what I love what you said. Like, it's more of like, how do you infuse a consciousness in the things that are already built so that we're not spending, hundreds of years destroying and dismantling something only to be like, well, now what do we do? We
Yeah,
clearly have tools that we as individuals have practiced that we can bring into every area of our life. It's not business and personal life anymore. It's conscious community. It's conscious business. It's conscious families. It's just consciousness, right? We raise our consciousness to your point, like you bring it everywhere, whether you're meditating or asking for a certain type of energy or whatever, like that could be normal within everything we're already doing. And I
correct.
really am excited for what you're trying to do, and that what you hope to do. And I think you will do it. I think it's inevitable. We have to. There's been way too much eye-opening awakening as far as, the last 5 years or so. I just don't think we can stop it. And we need people like you that are well-spoken and trained and already have this under your belt to come into these communities and businesses. So I'm excited. That's awesome.
Thank you. Well, you think of like our imagination as our highest form of intelligence, right? Our
Mm-hmm.
brain doesn't know the difference between real and imagined.
That's
So if
true.
if we can imagine it, then we can do it, right? And so people think, a lot of people that I work with, I have to shift them from like, I don't know how to have an imagination. I'm not imaginative, right? I'm not creative, right? And I'm like, okay, but how many times did you worry today? How many times did you think of the worst case scenario?
Ah,
Right? How many times did
yeah.
you go into that monkey mind and with the anxious
Yes,
brain?
the monkey for
But
sure. Yeah.
how many times did you agree with those thoughts today, right?
Yeah.
That is Worry is just the lowest form of imagination. We're using
Well
our
said.
imagination. Yeah.
Well said.
It's
Never
our
heard that before. Never heard that
it's
before. Well said.
it's yeah, thank you. It's the
Yeah.
lowest form of using our
Yes.
imagination. And so if
Gosh,
we can
that's so well
shift
said.
it into optimal, instead of like worrying about all of the worst case scenario, allowing all of that fear to have the power, right? If we
Mm.
can just shift one worry thought a day at a time, right? As soon as we notice a worry thought come in, we can go like cancel delete. You can cancel delete it right there. Right? Like I do that all the time. I'm like, all right, cancel delete. I don't actually think that. I'm not actually agreeing with that. I'm not disagree, cancel. I don't want to go with that today. I'm not
Unsubscribe.
unsubscribe. I hear people say that too. Like
Yeah.
I don't actually want to my cells to listen to that today. This is actually where I'm going, because
Yeah.
Our cells are listening, our body is listening, our body keeps score of our thoughts, our body keeps score of our words, deeds, and actions. It has there's a cause and effect on what we're doing in the world. The way that we're moving through the world, our habits, our morals, our beliefs, they all have an effect internally, and then we experience it externally, and that's the law of correspondence, right? Our internal environment creates our external reality. So internally, what we're doing, saying, believing, agreeing with, all of those things we then manifest in the world, and we're doing it, so many people are doing it unconsciously. So many
Yeah.
people have no idea that they're manifesting their reality just by living in the worry.
Yeah. Well said. And I think that you know, all I can do, I guess, from this point on is to hope, because you sound so well versed in what you know. I feel like you've embodied, you said, I embody sacred flow. I think that was on your website. And I'm feeling that from you. I'm hearing that from you. I think you're so well articulated in what you're saying, and you have all this wisdom to share. And so, how can people find you if they want to possibly just speak with you about these concepts or work with you? How do they find you?
Yeah, so the best place to reach me is going through my website. It's www.prismofbrilliance.biz. There you'll find places where you can book appointments, place where you can just reach out. My phone number, my email are there. All of my social media is there. If anyone wants to, I have a couple of workbooks that are out on Amazon. If you're not ready to quite reach out yet, those are available there. If you want to listen to any of the other podcasts I've done, those are there. If you want to read any of the things that I've published, those are there. So there's so many ways that you can get in touch with me. And then I also have a whole page of resources that has like playlists that I've built, or meditations from people in my community, or, say you're really interested in learning more about all of the modalities that I have training in, you can connect with Svaha right there. So there's so many things that exist on my website. So whether you want to reach out to me or someone that I work with, that's all there.
That's amazing. And I'm so glad you're a mother. I mean, you're probably just passing on so much wisdom to so many people through your community, through what you're going to do with businesses and communities, later, and with your kids. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of this wisdom and have a great conversation with you.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.